First of all, let me assert myself in my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. This is a very short little snippet from Franklin Delano Roosevelt's first inaugural speech, which he made in 1933. Today I'll be speaking about President Roosevelt from his childhood, his education, his adulthood prior to his presidency, and then finally his presidency and his death. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was born on January 30th, 1882 to James and Sarah Roosevelt. He fought his way through a very difficult delivery. He and his mom both almost died. He was homeschooled until he was 14 years old, and then he went to a private boarding school called Groton, which was in Massachusetts. He then moved on, according to Rebecca Larson in her book called Franklin D. Roosevelt, which was published in 1991, he moved on to Harvard University, where he did receive his bachelor's degree in 1903. He then continued at Harvard because he wanted to be able to remain as the editor of the school newspaper. He did some graduate work in, he studied history and economy, and at that time was when he fell in love with Anna Eleanor Roosevelt, who just happened to be his cousin once removed. And they were married on March the 17th, 1905. He did go on to practice law for a brief period of time, but he had always aspired to be a politician. He became a New York State Senator in 1910, and according to the WhiteHouse.gov website article on Franklin Roosevelt, he also held other positions such as Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He was struck down with poliomyelitis in August of 1921, and he was paralyzed in his legs after that time. He was fully paralyzed. He became the governor of New York in 1928, and he was actually, he had a very rough time in the very beginning of his governorship because of the stock market crash in 1929. But during that time, he was able to also prove himself, and he was able to help provide jobs to those who suffered so greatly from the crash. He, because he was able to prove himself, he was reelected in 1932, and many people considered his reelection to the seat of governor as a precursor to the presidential election in 1932. They were correct. He was elected in 1932 for the first of 4 times. He was inaugurated on March the 4th, 1933 for the very first time as president. And his very first job that he needed to take care of as the president was to solidify our banking system. Everything was crashing, banks were closing daily. And so he did this by pushing through a piece of legislation called the Emergency Banking Act. This was the first of many pieces of legislation that he pushed through as part of his New Deal plan. December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. This is another snippet from one of Franklin Roosevelt's speeches. This was a speech on the day after the attack on Pearl Harbor, whenever he asked Congress to declare war. According to Mark Updegrove, who wrote a book called Baptism by Fire, which was published in 2008, it was at this point that Franklin Roosevelt made a very shameful decision. He authorized the internment of over 100,000 Japanese Americans here in the United States in concentration camps. After that point, he also made the difficult decision to authorize the research and development of the atom bomb, which had its very, very big impact on the end of the war. But then by 1944, his health was failing very rapidly, and he started to have to delegate more and more of his responsibilities to his subordinates on a daily basis. On April the 12th of 1945, Franklin Roosevelt suffered a stroke, and he died 2 hours later without ever having regained consciousness. Franklin Roosevelt was a fighter. From the day he was born and had struggled to live, all the way through his presidency, and finally in death, he had to face many fears. He was more successful than any other president that we've had. He is the only person to have ever been elected to the office of president 4 times. He was not a perfect man, but as Eleanor said, shortly after he died, he did his job to the end.
All right, who's next?
What would the world be like if there were no megalomaniacs? Webster's dictionary defines